A visit. It is mid-morning on a spring day in 1967. Near a large private school for girls, I turned left into Sandfield Road, a residential street of two-story brick houses, each with its tidy front garden. Number 76 is a long way down the road. The house is painted white and is partially screened by a tall fence, a hedge, and overhanging trees. I park the car, open the arched gate, and go up the short path between the rose bushes and ring the front bell. For a long time there is silence except for the rumble of distant traffic in the main road. I'm beginning to think of ringing again, or of turning away, when the door is opened by Professor Tolkien. He is slightly smaller than I expected. Tallness is a quality of which he makes much in his books, so it is a little surprising to see that he himself is slightly less than average height. Not much, but just enough to be noticeable. I introduce myself and, since I made this appointment in advance and am expected, the quizzical and somewhat defensive look that first met me is replaced by a smile. A hand is offered, and my own is firmly grasped. This is the account offered by Humphrey Carpenter in his work, J.R.R. Tolkien, A Biography. My name is Larry, and you're listening to the Tolkien Podcast. Hey, before I get into the meat of the podcast, I have to express a little gratitude. I really do appreciate the support of the Tolkien podcast so far. I know that when I try to find it on my own, it's really hard. It's not recognized very well by Google or AI, and they give me all these alternatives. So somehow, some way, people are hearing and finding and listening to the Tolkien podcast. And I think the only way that's possible is from word of mouth, which I really appreciate. It's a lot more fun to talk and think somebody's listening than just to talk. If you find anything valuable here, my ask is that you tell one other person about it. And word of mouth is the best way for these types of things. If it's of value, share it. But somehow, some way, people are listening, and Europe is responsible for 40% of those listens, which is pretty cool. We've actually managed to appear on every continent. So we got somebody in Africa to listen. Well, I guess we didn't get Antarctica. It's not listed, so I don't know. But, you know, the U.S. where I live is naturally going to have the most listens. I think people who know me, in fact, just listen. But after that, it's the U.K., Germany, France, and Ireland, which, by the way, I have ancestry from all of those nations. And then Australia, which I was lucky enough to go to once, and Sweden. And then Norway, where I have more ancestors. So thanks, Norway. But also shout out to places like Hong Kong, United Arab Emirates, Singapore, Netherlands, Portugal, Canada, Puerto Rico, Russia, New Zealand. In fact, hey, New Zealand, you could do better. I have friends there. Why aren't they listening? Switzerland, where I visited for the first time in my life this year. Greece, India, Brazil, Philippines, Colombia, Spain, Austria. Well, I also visited Austria this year. It was lovely. Belgium, Romania, been there. Poland, Serbia, Costa Rica, Finland, Italy, Denmark, Morocco, Bangladesh, Saudi Arabia, Jersey, Croatia, Iran, Uruguay, and Japan. That's amazing to me. It's amazing that anyone in any of those places would take a moment and listen to anything that I have to say about Tolkien. And it's humbling, it's fun, it's super fun, and it's really appreciated. The list of cities is also pretty crazy to me. Salt Lake City, where I live, leads the way. No shocker there. But followed by like Frankfurt and Bristol and Buffalo and Toowoomba in Queensland, which is I don't even know where that is. Southwark, Leeds, Dublin, Oslo, Chicago, Cleveland, New York, of course, Berlin, Greeley, which is in Colorado, Stockholm, some Carolina cities, Clarksville, Tennessee. I have been to Tennessee, but I sure don't know anyone in Clarksville. The list just goes on, and there are a lot of like foreign cities, and I find that to be amazing. So I do sincerely mean it when I say thank you. You've made my life a little better. It's a real bright spot to think that somebody wants to hear things that I might have to say. But that's not why you came here. Let's get on with it. I don't know for certain, but I have a suspicion that there are just a very small handful of people who actually met in person J.R.R. Tolkien. I read the Humphrey Carpenter passage because he clearly did. but not too many people still living met Mr. Tolkien. Other than his immediate family, I feel like there's going to be very few of those people. Roy Tolkien, who was born in 1969, surely met his great-grandfather, but in my conversations with him, he didn't have any specific memories of him, and I didn't ask him about that specifically. I was just trying to be not somebody who was friends with him because of his grandfather, but just because he was a cool guy. So we didn't talk about that really specifically, but he would have been 3 or 4 years old when his grandfather passed, and maybe he has a memory of a funeral, and he probably has pictures of things like that, which help you kind of retain those memories. But he didn't have any kind of intimate knowledge, any kind of personal knowledge. He couldn't tell you some of those details which make a person, authentic and real and your friend. So since we're zeroing in on about 50 years, approximately a little more than 50 years since Tolkien's death, that means there are people who are probably 10 and 20 years old who had occasion to meet him, but not many. I don't know where it originates from, but I believe it's mostly true, and that is that people who know don't talk, and people who talk don't know. Obviously, that's not like hardcore gospel truth always. It's not, but it's often the case, especially about sensitive topics or personal topics or things that maybe we don't shout from the rooftops. Maybe we keep them close to our hearts, or maybe we save them for when we inevitably want to write a memoir. So here we are in 2025, and the fascination with J.R.R. Tolkien has not decreased. If anything, it has increased in this century. And instead of firsthand accounts or people who knew Tolkien well, we have letters he wrote and letters they wrote, and we have accounts that he kept of himself, which any person who journals or takes notes, there's a little bit of self-bias that creeps in. We are very fortunate to have recordings of his voice, reading some of his works. But going back to my statement that people who don't know talk, which may include me, I admit, but at the risk of repeating myself in every single episode, I am not a Tolkien scholar. I'm a journalist, a guy who asks questions. And, by the way, I would love to ask questions to J.R.R. Tolkien. That would be a lifetime dream. And if that opportunity did arise, I would be pretty far down the list of people who get to interview him anyway, journalist or not. So Tolkien, the writer of myth, has become a myth and a legend. Not quite, well, probably in his own time too, but definitely now. As I speak, the very moment that I speak, very likely, there is a play happening in Washington, D.C. called Tolkien and Lewis. It is written by Dean Batali. I hope I'm saying that right. And Mr. Dean, if you're out there, hey, I'd love to talk to you. Dean was a producer on a couple of shows that almost certainly you've heard of. One is That 70s Show. Another is Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Sabrina, Secrets of a Teenage Witch. Well, it turns out Dean is also a playwright, and he wrote this play called Tolkien and Lewis, which, as I mentioned, I think it's on stage as I speak in Washington, D.C., and it runs through November 30th. So if you're there, this is your heads up, go buy a ticket and watch the play. I have it on pretty good authority that it's quite good. Someone that I know, but not super well, just mentioned it in passing and said, oh, hey, by the way, that play's really good. I had no idea what the play was. I didn't know what they were talking about, so I had to do a little research and look it up. It seems that the play also was in London. I'm not entirely sure that it's the same, but I think it must be the same. One thing websites don't do a great job of is, well, they're there to sell a ticket for a current production, but they don't leave a lot of legacy information after a play ends its run, which is understandable, but not ideal for the Tolkien podcast. So this production, Tolkien and Lewis, that ends in November, also played most definitely in January through March. It was popular enough that it was held over through March of this same year. So this is not the first production. The premise of the play is that Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, if I haven't said, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, who were friends, who were both Oxford Dons back in the day, who were filling lecture halls at an exciting time to be in Oxford, would meet weekly with other writers. Owen Barfield and Charles Williams are two of the others, and there was a rotating cast who would show up and read these things, including C.S. Lewis's brother. And unfortunately, no women were allowed, even women that were respected and liked by them. They thought the whole affair was completely unsuitable for them. So forgive me if that's not enough background. Tolkien and Lewis in the play and in real life met at a place called Eagle and Child as a pub. The play is set inside that pub. And in case you aren't aware, Tolkien was instrumental in helping Lewis, who had been an atheist, sort of evolve his ideas about religion and become a religious person who, in the Chronicles of Narnia, wrote really transparent and obvious character types that were, sit-ins for Jesus, Aslan the Lion, for example. Now, Tolkien's religion is also apparent in his works, but in a much more subtle way, and in fact, in a way you can, and often they are ignored completely, but the undertones are certainly there, and certainly when you investigate further into his writings, you understand he was performing an act of subcreation as a sort of a way to honor the creator or God. Tolkien called C.S. Lewis Jack, and Jack called Tolkien Tollers. I'm not sure if it's Tollers or Tollers. I'm not British. I would say it wrong no matter how I say it. They were very close friends, and that closeness didn't last. In fact, they had some trouble. They had some, although they remained friends, they weren't as close as they had been. Some people believe Charles Williams displaced Tolkien a bit, and he was, sad, hurt, offended, whatever. They had a lot in common, but they had some differences as well. Both were religious, but Tolkien was ardently Catholic while Lewis was Anglican. They also had a difference of how they wrote their fantasy, definitely metaphor versus non-metaphor, things like that. But they had a tremendous amount in common as well as men who survived war, men who wrote what they wrote. But play isn't a work of biography. It's not trying to capture what happened in the Eagle and Pub. Rather, it's a work of fiction. It's a fictional account of these two gentlemen, and especially in their later years, when they talked about some of these differences, maybe in religion and philosophy and worldview and writing even, and how they perhaps reconciled some of those differences. I am not able to jump on a plane and fly to DC and watch the play. And if I did, I would want to just interview the writer, especially. I would love to see it, but I won't have a chance. Somebody, if you're in DC, please do. If you know anyone in the area interested in arts, have them go. Love to actually hear from them. The bigger point, and the reason I bring all this up, is what I said before. Tolkien has passed into myth, and C.S. Lewis has also passed into a mythical literary figure. So to open the show, I read from Humphrey Carpenter's biography of Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien, a biography, a pretty obvious but pretty clear title. Carpenter also wrote another book called The Inklings, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, and their friends. And this literary group, these Inklings, have inspired a lot of other people to write about them as well. In fact, there's another play written pretty recently, but instead of just Tolkien and just Lewis, but it does focus on the two of them, it's a 7-person play. I think some of these other characters come into it, including wives. It's written by Ron Reed, who wrote a pretty long essay about why he wrote this play and how his feelings about it. It's not that long. He wrote a thorough essay, I should say, about these things. You can Google that if you want. Ron Reed, double E in Reed. And his play is about Tolkien and Lewis. If you go currently right now the second to YouTube and you search Fellowship, Tolkien and Lewis, you'll find a documentary, which I watched a bit of. It has pretty good production values. And it talks about them and some other literary influences. Oh, but that is not the end. If you were to go to Apple TV, I happen to not have it. But if you do, you can watch a show, I think it was made for television, called Tolkien and Lewis, Myth, Imagination, and the Quest for Meaning. If that doesn't scratch your itch, there is also on YouTube, it's based on a PowerPoint lecture from Eve Lewis, who is pretty smart. This is a lecture she had and had not, I guess, put on YouTube. And then I think it was the Tolkien movie that came out that inspired her. She said it was good, but it wasn't accurate. So she rustled up her notes. I think she's been interviewed here and there. She's definitely an expert. And she produced her notes into a video. It's like an hour and 25 minutes based on her lecture with PowerPoint. So it's visual as well. And it's called J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, A Legendary Friendship. And of course, there's the 2019 movie called Tolkien, which I think was like at least for a while, the last great Tolkien bit we're going to have from Hollywood for quite a while. And I don't think it did very well financially. It leaned heavily into the idea that Tolkien's experiences were not only the inspiration, but virtually the one-to-one metaphor for the dark things that happened in his novels. Tolkien himself, in fact, I'm going to go pick up Humphrey Carpenter again, but Tolkien himself really didn't like the idea that biography was a way to examine literary works. So you can watch that movie and you can see the idea that they, a screenwriter and a producer and some talented actors, really talented actors, actually, I really like that cast, but they thought the idea that we could make Tolkien's life cinematic. And I'm not sure it's not the approach I would take, and I'm not sure it's the best approach, but let's read Humphrey Carpenter. This is from Oxford in 1976. It's an author's note. It says, quote, Tolkien himself did not entirely approve of biography, or rather, he disliked its use as a form of literary criticism. Quoting Tolkien inside the quote by Carpenter, one of my strongest opinions, he wrote, is that investigation of an author's biography is an entirely vain and false approach to his works. End Tolkien quote. Continue with Carpenter's quote. Yet he was undoubtedly aware that the remarkable popularity of his fiction made it highly likely that a biography would be written after his death. And indeed, he appears to have made some preparation for this himself, for in the last years of his life, he annotated a number of old letters and papers with explanatory notes or other comments. He also wrote a few pages of recollections of his childhood. It may thus be hoped that this book would not be entirely foreign to his wishes. So, close quote. So while Carpenter was a little uncomfortable with biography, whoever wrote and produced the movie, which I haven't looked up in a minute, certainly was not uncomfortable with that, since they did that exactly one-to-one on the nose, as on the nose as you can be, actually, to relate this scene of war equaled this scene in the book, which it is safe to say Tolkien would have hated. And it might have had something to do. It's hard to honor the movie. It's hard to honor the man in a movie with a movie and then so blatantly disrespect the man you're trying to honor. That's a little awkward, at least for me. On the other hand, if you were to make a biography of Tolkien, it would be a guy who loves, I guess the Inklings is one of the ways that you could try to do that. And you are writing about a guy who loves to be at home with his family and sits at his desk and writes and lectures at Oxford. And it's a little challenging to find a conflict in that movie or to make it cinematic. It seems a little bit doomed to failure. In fact, there's not any of the great biopics that you watch, biography movies. Typically, they're about very flawed people who had very wild, disturbed lives, or films focus on periods in their lives that are really challenging or tough. I'm thinking, actually, when I say all this, it's a lot of musicians recently that have fit that. There's not a lot of great biography movies, biopics about authors. Maybe authors sitting and writing isn't as exciting as, say, you can see somebody strike a chord. You can see somebody work out a melody. You can see all that. That's a little hard to do on paper. I don't know really anything about the life and times of Bruce Springsteen, but I did recently see his film, or the film about him, and I enjoyed it very much. But it absolutely focused on a period of depression and turmoil in his life, a really hard period in his life. Now, I don't know if Bruce Springsteen approved the script. I have a feeling that he did work with them, and I have a feeling he was willing to be so vulnerable by letting that depressing part of his life story be told, because I don't know, could have all been made up, but it sure was personal. It sure felt personal. It was really good. Well, Tolkien didn't really have anything like that. He didn't have anything like the troubles of Bob Dylan. His troubles were paying bills and, getting or not getting promotions in the education system. Now, early in his life, he surely had some really cinematic visual troubles. He lost all of his friends in World War I, his closest friends. And he was an orphan, and his parents died early. Like, he had a lot of trauma early in his life. But again, he loathed the idea that his biography would be a way to examine his literary works. So sorry, that was a bit of a tangent, but there was a movie called Tolkien in 2019. If you didn't see it, you probably should. There are also quite a number of books there's many about C.S. Lewis, actually, but there's quite a few about C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien and the Inklings. So I'm going to mention some of those. Whether you like Amazon or not, that's fine, but it is convenient that you can buy just about any book you want and have it delivered to you pretty quickly, including most of these. There's one called The Company They Keep by Diana Pavlak-Glyer, but that is not the only book that she wrote about them. She wrote a book, a highly regarded book. I've read neither one of these. I thought about buying them in Audible. The second one's called Bandersnatch, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and the creative collaboration of the Inklings. The Inklings, in case I said Inkling singular. There is another book called The Inklings and King Arthur, J.R.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, C.S. Lewis, and Owen Barfield on the Matters of Britain. There is also a book called The Fellowship: The Literary Lives of the Inklings, Tolkien, Lewis, Barfield, Williams. Oh, but that's not all. There is a book called The Inklings of Oxford. It's by Harry Lee Poe. I haven't read the book, but I know of it, and I've not been to Oxford or the neighborhood, but it is sort of a walking tour of Magdalen College. The Eagle and Child Pub is included in there, Christchurch, and the other locations that were familiar to the Inklings. So I don't know, if you're in the neighborhood, that might be a handy guide to grab. Another respected author is Colin Durez. He's well thought of, and he's especially a C.S. Lewis scholar, as I understand it. But his contributions to Tolkien scholarship have been appreciated by the Tolkien Society for sure. His book is called The Oxford Inklings, instead of : Lewis, Tolkien, and Their Circle. So there's a lot. Well, that's not even all. The point of all this is that for some reason, these myths and legends have inspired a lot of writers, the same people who produce shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I mean that as a compliment, by the way. I think that was a really well-made show, not entirely to my taste, but undoubtedly well-made. And that 70s show obviously was massively popular. Anyway, people like that find Tolkien and Lewis inspirational, and especially, well, both individually, but also especially their relationship to each other. It's really taken on a life of its own. It's almost a subgenre. In Utah, where I live, there is a company that is committed to making clean films. By clean, they mean they don't have swear words, or they don't have boobies or whatever. They don't want nudity in them, which is absolutely fine. And I'm not criticizing that. I'm just telling it like it is. And they are catering to an audience that definitely wants that. Well, Tolkien and Lewis, they also have fan bases that don't generally want that kind of thing. Tolkien, of course, besides his own non-religious following, has a dedicated Catholic following. So the studio in Utah is making a film. I think it's called Fellowship: something. Tolkien and Lewis and Tolkien, something like that. They announced it something like 2 years ago, and if I'm not mistaken, it might be animated. But regardless, it fits their profile. It fits family-friendly and clean. Although, Lewis had a non-conventional relationship with a woman that Tolkien didn't approve of. It's the basis of another movie called Shadowlands, starring the great Anthony Hopkins. Admittedly not read up a great deal on their conflict, and I'm not that interested in it, but I know it existed. Anyhow, they're making this Tolkien-Lewis film production of some kind. They recently made a film, a true story about a religious boy who kind of ratted out the Nazis, or was working against the Nazis in World War II Germany. But what they left out is that he got kicked out of his church. At least on the local level, his church leaders were supportive of Nazis and excommunicated him. But I'm always, Nazis killing Jews maybe isn't a great theme to show in a family-friendly way. Not because they can't be, but because maybe the horrors of war ought to be displayed. Maybe the worst things ought to be on film because they happen, because murder and racism and things aren't nice and aren't family-friendly. And that actually is okay. The point is, I don't know what they'll do with the Tolkien and Lewis story, but I'll probably watch it. The bigger point is J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis are mythical figures, and lots of people are inspired. But I also think it's pretty important that we mark the figure of Tolkien and Lewis for that matter, but Tolkien as he really was, as he actually was, that we keep those things in mind. And with that in mind, I'm going to turn to Humphrey Carpenter again and read a little bit more. Tolkien at this point was alone. His wife had died. It's 1973. He writes a letter that Carpenter quotes from, and then he travels, quoting, 3 days after writing this letter on Tuesday, 28 August, he, meaning Tolkien, traveled down to Bournemouth to stay with Dennis and Jocelyn Tolhurst. The end was swift. On the Thursday, he joined in celebrations to mark Mrs. Tolhurst's birthday, but he did not feel well and would not eat much, though he drank a little champagne. During the night, he was in pain, and the next morning he was taken to a private hospital where an acute bleeding gastric ulcer was diagnosed. It so happened that Michael was on holiday in Switzerland, and Christopher in France, and neither could have reached his bedside in time. But John and Priscilla were able to come down to Bournemouth to be with him. At first, the reports on his condition were optimistic, but by Saturday, a chest infection had developed, and early on Sunday morning, 2 September 1973, he died, 81. Close quote. Carpenter then writes that if you head on down to Oxford to the Magdalen, where the Inklings met, even Humphrey Carpenter gets back to the Inklings here, that, you can view them however most people like to view them, the popular view and all these other things. He talks about visiting the graves of the three men, C.S. Lewis, Charles Williams, and J.R.R. Tolkien, the three most important of the Inklings. He says, Tolkien being a Catholic, there aren't a lot of places for Catholics to be buried at Oxford. So while you can find Lewis and Williams' graves, members of the Church of England, there is no Catholic burial place at Oxford, with one exception, but that's not where Tolkien was going to be buried. So he says you have to leave town and travel far, relatively far. So you find a private cemetery, and many of the names in this Catholic section are actually Polish names because they were Catholic and they immigrated to the area. And in the Catholic area, you'll find tombs that have glazed photos of the deceased. I'm going to quote him again. In consequence, a gray slab of Cornish granite rather to the left of the group stands out clearly, as it does its slightly curious wording. Quote, Edith Mary Tolkien, Luthien, 1889 to 1971. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, Baron, 1892 to 1973. A mass was held for Tolkien in Oxford 4 days after his death. His son John chose the services. He was a very religious priest, I believe. Sorry that I don't know that just off the top of my head. There was no service or really quotations from Tolkien's writings. I certainly don't pretend to know what Tolkien would have thought was appropriate, and certainly whatever his family chose is what was appropriate. But a few weeks later in California, some of his American admirers, of which there were many by 1973, held a service as well. And they read they did use some of his words, maybe not the ones you would expect. They read some of Leaf by Niggle, one of his works. And Humphrey says maybe Tolkien would not have considered it inappropriate. I can't think of a better way to talk about Tolkien and to close comments about the man who has become a myth and literally a legend. Here's a passage from Leaf by Niggle where a painter is trying to complete his masterpiece, a tree, but he can't because of many interruptions. Before him stood the tree, his tree, finished. If you could say that of a tree that was alive, its leaves opening, its branches growing and bending in the wind that Niggle had so often felt and guessed and had so often failed to catch. He gazed at the tree, and slowly he lifted his arms and opened them wide. It's a gift, he said. Close quote. A fitting epitaph for the man who had become the mythic J.R.R. Tolkien. My name is Larry, and you've been listening to the Tolkien Podcast.